came to India for the first time in February or March 1962, 43 years ago, 2, even 3 generations ago. These things in India move quite fast. One of the things I noticed in that far-off time was that the newspapers had little of the news I looked for. The financial and sport pages were, of course, full of private event, as always. On the other pages, there seemed to be mainly political speeches. The editorials, sometimes full of bile, could be as private as the speeches. In 1962, the newspapers seemed to me to be in every way an office job, with little room in them for the country outside. That, at any rate, is how I remember them. Today, of course, it is all changed. The newspapers, I'm speaking very broadly and a little mischievously, do classified advertisements, in this way going back to their original function. The television news programs do news. They live, the television programs, by presenting the country to itself. And they do it with a vividness and directness newspapers could never manage. The country is better informed about itself than at any time in its history, and curiosity grows. This represents an enormous intellectual advance, and it hasn't occurred in isolation. It has occurred with many of the other things that are supposed to accompany intellectual advance. There are now serious Indian publishing houses. There were only 1 or 2 in 1962. There are many Indian writers in English who publish successfully in Britain and the United States. With a natural wish to emulate, everyone shares the national patrimony after all, and everyone feels that one big family book stirring inside him. And because the educated population is huge, new writers spring up all the time. As if to match this apparent creative frenzy, standards of printing and book and magazine manufacture, for so long so low, have in the last few years become as good as anywhere else. Industrial processes have generally improved, since in the modern world, nothing can stand alone. Industry has ramified, and so have skills and science. There is every kind of training school. So it goes on, all the interlocking parts of a modern economy and a modern culture falling into place as the need arises. It is a wonderful, even an awesome process, and it can be seen most clearly in a country like India, where so much is so new and so much of the landscape still so barren. It might be asked whether the beginnings of this change couldn't be seen 42 years ago. I'm sure some people, visionaries, or people of great faith, did see it. Or, since in our fast-changing mechanical age, the future can never be precisely imagined, I'm sure some people had an idea that changes were to come. But I didn't see it. I was young, in my 30th and 31st year, and I hadn't learned to travel. There are 2 kinds of literary travel: travel as personal adventure and travel as inquiry. Both are arts, and both have to be learned. I believe now, for travel as inquiry, that the future is contained in the present, and the present can be fruitfully studied only by someone without politics or prejudice. In India in 1962, I couldn't be dispassionate. I saw everything through the haze of my own nerves. In those days, when the newspapers had no news, poverty wasn't a subject. When it did come up, it was a matter for Gandhian-like contemplation. Poverty had its own beauty. It could lead to religion. It was India's special gift to a materialist world. This is amazing today, but ideas like that were deeply rooted. 9 years later, in 1971, when I went to look at an election in Rajasthan, I found the Gandhian candidate campaigning on moral grounds against the introduction of piped water in the villages. Water from the well was good enough, he said. Take away the well. Women would be without that virtuous daily exercise, and heaven knows what immorality would follow. In 1962, I could find no markers of the world to come 40 years later. I couldn't imagine an India without Gandhi, as India is today. And recognizing old errors, what markers can I find now of the India of 2040? There is industry, there is money, there is self-awareness all the way down, there are many writers, there is a film industry that is more interesting than Hollywood. Where will it lead to? This time, it's not a question of looking ahead with India alone in mind. It's a question of the future of the machine world, of which India is now part. I think of this future in no apocalyptic science fiction way. I mean something simpler, but just as worrying. I used to believe that a country's future was dictated by its intellectual life. And it's obvious in many countries you travel. If you go to Mauritania, you can judge its future by its intellectual life. If you go to England, I think you have a shrewd idea of what will happen because of the intellectual life. I thought countries like India could catch up only if they became, in the profoundest way, educated, if they developed curiosity and acquired not only learning, but some new idea of human possibility. This would have been true at one time, but it's obviously not true now. The Arab oil countries have demonstrated that in our modern interdependent world, there is a substitute for education. It is money. That is not easy to live with. It overturns the philosophies and folk wisdom of the millennia, and it goes against the recent history of India and Japan. India's first important modern reformer, Ram Mohan Roy, died as long ago as 1831 in England. He was born before the French Revolution. As for Japan, just 100 years or so ago, the Irish, Greek, American writer with the strange name of Lafcadio Hearn was writing of the pain of Meiji Japan, his adopted country, as it sought to educate itself from top to bottom into the ways of the new world. To read Lafcadio Hearn is to feel that Japan has perhaps not got over the strain of that experience. Things are much easier in our post-war world, less flagrant than the Arab oil countries are those countries of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, who have sought to have an industrial revolution. They have imported that revolution and paid for it with their natural resources. Until the other day, these countries had a pastoral population. At one bound now, without the education of India and without the pain of Japan, they have joined the modern world while remaining in a profound way uneducated, with nothing like an intellectual life. Modern technology can appear to work miracles. It can set down the modern world like magic anywhere. 10 years ago, some of the villages outside Jakarta in Java had a strange aspect. Beside the main road, for mile after mile, were the repeating empty houses of new developments, fresh with paint, awaiting buyers. At the back of that line of houses, which stood like a sage set, a flimsy, protective facade, yet casting real shadows, were the old villages, quite intact, still full of green, with old-fashioned country shops with pitched corrugated iron roofs. I don't know what happened when the crisis came, as it did some years ago. There was an extraordinary devaluation which made modernity in those countries look like a kind of economic dry rot. It made me think of something in another continent, of West Africa and the Ivory Coast, where the president, Houphouët-Boigny, animated by a similar wish to modernize, to do away with the bush, and all at once, had laid down an extravagant metropolis in the wet forest around his native village. But modern buildings are not simply structures. They have wires, plumbing, elevators. If they are not used, they crumble away. The very things that make for convenience encourage ruin. The forest quickly claims its own. This metropolis, Yamoussoukro is the name, had no proper function. And when the crisis came in the Ivory Coast, it made me think of the overgrown, pillaged settlements in Rwanda and the Congo, on the other side of the continent, where for other reasons, the settlements had no true function. Modern technology is attractive. It is easily portable, but it is also fragile. I don't know what road India now opened up will take. I have no idea what the country will look like in 40 years. There are many models of modern economies around us now, but I don't think it is possible to say that India will look like this one or like that one. Modern technology is dynamic. Already, we can look back to the 1950s as to an incomplete time, with our modern world only half made. The information sciences took us by surprise. We have no means of visualizing the technologies of 40 years ahead, or the changes those technologies will make to the world of work and to society generally. Economists are more secure. They have an idea of a goal for all men, possibly the same goal for all men, whether in Equatorial Guinea, small population, much oil, or Norway, blessed in the same way. And they can make projections, beginning with figures and ending with figures. But men are more than economic creatures. And to the figures for India for 40 years hence, there has to be added the idea that modern technology, when it becomes overwhelming with its own momentum, can lead to a great unknown. The first industrial revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, to which Mr. Akbar referred. The first industrial revolution led to such an unknown in those countries. It brought new wealth and power to Western Europe. It gave immense benefits to the world, but it ravaged landscapes and pastoral communities in the producing countries. It is possible that the technologies to come will give India this kind of shock. I'm not speaking against the modern world. It would be absurd for me to do so. I'm part of that world. I have no Gandhian nor Tolstoyan wish to shut out modern life. To me, the idea of the ashram is a parasitic one, intellectually false. It requires everybody outside to keep the materialist world going. The man within spares himself that pain, lives only with the idea of his abnegation. To cope with all the unforeseen stresses that economic success may bring, India will need the opposite. It will need something beyond its ancient philosophies. It will need, in spite of the example of the Arab and Southeast Asian countries, a strong and modern intellectual life. History shows that success in the world goes hand in hand with intellectual advance. The great British names of the 18th and 19th centuries, the time of empire, are not only the names of prime ministers and sailors and soldiers. They're reformers, Shaftesbury, Owen, Wilberforce. There's a writer like Dickens, larger than the dark, newly industrial society that made him. There are scientists like Faraday and scientific writers like Darwin who remake the world. There are historians and travelers and inquirers in 100 different fields. And above all, there are the social and artistic critics, Ruskin, William Morris, Bernard Shaw, in intelligent revolt against the brutishness of their world. Intelligent revolt. These men, and all the other names I have mentioned, do not rail and run away. They have an idea of a world put right and didn't want to run away. I was referring indirectly, of course, to the ashram ideal. At the time when these men were doing their work, it might have seemed that they were doing little, hardly affecting the momentum of the machine. Later it became clear that these dissenting tangential voices of aesthetics and reform had not only softened the machine age, they had also helped to create a new and attractive British civilization. This civilization lasted until the other day. It seemed to have been always there, a folk creation, but it had been created by these dissenting voices. Yet it could have gone the other way. To introduce the people of a country to machine ways is a brutal business. Ambition and greed and hurt and passion can do away with reason. Germany, with the great 19th century roll call of philosophers and scholars, scientists, mathematicians, and astronomers, yet somehow lost the 20th century. And in the beginning of that century, Russia, with a great developing civilization, yet politically unbalanced, committed suicide, like Iran in 1979, rejecting the Shah, and more profoundly, turning away from the new and the worrying, finding in the recesses of its mind and heart an unshakable nostalgia for the certainties and ecstasies of its religion. Nostalgia also came upon Japan after the pain and striving of the Meiji time. I make this list of countries, and you can add others from Southeast Asia, to make the point that the future of India cannot be assessed from the rates of growth alone. In fact, if we go by the experience of some other countries, increasing general wealth might start laying bare many of the conflicting nostalgias and sources of old pain that poverty and subjection kept half covered up. This is a potentially dangerous time, and more than ever, India needs a sound intellectual life. Such a life is not automatically created by a large number of educated people. It is something that goes beyond that. The intellectual life I have in mind is like a live current that runs through a country. It receives and stores ideas and thought beyond everyone's professional discipline. It expresses a general concern and is sensitive to everything that's new. It feeds a society and keeps it on its toes. It unifies in a special way, gives a country a profound identity. I would say, from what I've read, that in all India, Bengal, at the beginning of the last century, had such a life. Politics later swamped that life. What should have been a flame in independent India is now only a flicker. I suppose it can be said that in the later stages of the independence movement, India was energized by something like an intellectual life. The cause gave grandeur to many people. India seemed full of giants. Afterwards, when these men became politicians and administrators, their grandeur, through no fault of their own, was less easy to see. Independent India has released the talent of many millions of its people. It ought to have generated an autonomous intellectual life. But its poverty and its colonial past are in the way. Its writers seek to be published abroad, in Britain and the United States. In Indian eyes, that is where real books are made and judged, where rewards are greater, and where there is a possibility of glory beyond anything that might come in India. So Indian writing becomes exotic and is offered as such, becomes part of the American scene, shall we say, with everything that happens to that writing in India being secondary. There is justice of a sort in this, because modern writing is new to India, and Indian criticism as yet hardly exists. I will break off and tell this little story about the Russian writer Turgenev. He spent much of his writing life outside Russia. In Paris, he got to know the great French writers of the day. At a gathering one evening, it might have been in the late 1870s, he heard the Frenchmen complain that they had to work very hard to make a living. They were paid so little. When Turgenev heard how much these great French names were paid, he had to bite his lip. Not only did he, Turgenev, have a private fortune, he was paid very much more by the Russian magazines, the so-called thick magazines. Russia was despotically ruled and was thought of as a barbarous land. But writing mattered. It was felt to be something that could change the society. It had a market, and it could be handsomely rewarded. This cannot be said of India. To make the money point first, and it is not a trivial one, magazines and newspapers don't like paying. That glory of fair pay for a serious piece of work or a good advance for a book happens only in the great world outside. The Indian approach is more Gandhian and austere. Publication, it is felt, is its own reward. So Indian writers in English, and these, rather than the regional writers, are most in the spotlight here. These writers look to the world outside. That is where their books are published, reviewed, and sold. That is where a book makes its reputation. So the strange situation arises in which India, with all its pride in its post-independence writers, becomes curiously provincial, accepting a lesser intellectual life for itself. I can think of no national literature that has been created in this way. Turgenev, moving from one European country to another, following the French singer he adored, admiring the French writers he knew a little more than he should, always in his writing aimed at his Russian audience and wrote in Russian. Alexander Herzen was in exile for most of his adult life. And Herzen is a contemporary of Dickens, 1812, 1870. But the magazine Herzen edited in London for exiles was in Russian. To write for a home audience is to write out of a knowledge that one shares many things with one's audience. Many things can be left unsaid, and it is easier for the writer to go beyond the simple laying out of his material. To write habitually for a foreign audience is to be tempted or to be coerced by an editor into being purely descriptive. In this way, writing can lose its essence, its true value, which is its capacity to subvert or be more than its material. It has taken many generations for India to produce the writing it has produced. And this dependence on foreign judgment would have been the most cruel waste if this literature, like Russian literature in the 19th century, were the most important creative form in the country, bringing real news, new news, so to speak, rather than old marks, modifying and remaking sensibility, the way the Mahatma did. I'm being provocative. But Indian writing, for the reasons I've given, cannot have this role. India has something which 19th century Russia didn't have. It has the cinema, popular and immense. For all its borrowings, Indian popular cinema is autonomous. It lives by the suffrage of the poor, and at the same time it links high and low. It is constantly evolving. It is where, like it or not, India has truly found itself. And it cannot apply for a green card and leave the country. I suppose it can be said that if the migrating scientific talent had stayed behind, there would have been a festering, so to speak, and there might have been a chance of a fuller intellectual life developing here. But really, I doubt whether India would have known how to make room for those men. Science, I believe, would have continued to exist in its dark corner. Only one newspaper, as there is today, would have had a regular science feature. The ideas of scientists would never have enriched the common pool of ideas. And who would have wanted, in the dark 1930s, to deny Chandrasekhar the chance of going to Chicago? And who would want today to deny opportunity to all the Indian scientists abroad, whose names appear so often in the science journals and magazines, and are a source of pride to all of us? The scientific migration is not really a loss. The world of science is for the most part an international world, and the work done by Indian scientists abroad, like the work of Indian writers abroad, is accessible to people here. So India can, for the time being at any rate, live with the migration of its writers and scientists. But the migration, which can appear to become the disaffection of certain kinds of academics, workers of the humanities, is another matter. I'm thinking especially of the historians. History is more than an academic subject here. You might say it is too important to be left to the historians. India vitally needs to arrive at an understanding of its history. Every other country has such an understanding of itself. India doesn't, and this lack makes it incomplete and vulnerable. Without this understanding, that idea of how we have become what we are, the world doesn't make sense. We, as individuals or a community, can become the prey of every kind of fantasy. That understanding of history is the starting point of every kind of inquiry. For a society not to have that understanding is the equivalent almost of the society believing that the sky is blue paint or gray or white or black paint and nothing more. I remember a distinguished Indian journalist and writer saying some years ago, when the talk turned to history, we thought we had left that behind in 1947. It was his way of saying that history was pain, recent and not so recent, and the best way of dealing with history was to find a way around it, to fudge and forget. I don't myself think that's a good way. It's hardly a way at all. I feel as a writer that the best way of dealing with any kind of pain is to face it. It's the only way pain can become manageable. Indian history, of course, has its own difficulties. Its beginnings are lost. Beginnings of Indian history are lost. It is possible, in Italy, to disentangle something of the world of the Etruscans, the Italian people or tribe who were dispossessed and then absorbed by the Romans. You can still see in Orvieto the remains of their mighty city walls. You can still, in some places, see their funerary sculpture, and in those semi-recumbent, half-smiling white marble figures, you can still come face to face with their ideal of themselves. But of ancient India, very old India, almost no monument remains, apart from the very ruined ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa across the border. And they are a puzzle of great age, seemingly related to nothing we know. India's true remains are literary. They are immense, and for the historian, problematical. They're the great still-living epics, not only in India, but over much of Southeast Asia, with their amazing knowledge and acceptance of human behavior. These works can be taken as a record of a tribal past. Their perfection and their length are mysterious. It is as if much of the energy of a later civilization went over a further unrecorded period to this act of recall. They are the great works of religious and philosophical speculation. Side by side with these emanations of a high culture, you have the laws of Manu, which feels like a rustic production. These works and others are full of contradictory pointers to the life of the people who created them. It is hard to make a whole of them. The effect is that of pages detached from a broken or unbound volume. The field is thus open to every kind of dispute. The middle period of Indian history, the period of the invasions, is more contentious still. There are people, at once austere and broad-minded, who say that the invasions made no great change in the mess of India. There are the Quranic schools, on the other hand, here and across the border, who say that India is a conquered land and is of value only insofar as it is part of the Arab story. This point of view is closer to the thinking, in parts coincides with the thinking of the broad-minded people who consider the dereliction about them and feel that there is nothing in India as India alone and resent any attempt to move them towards an Indian view of things. This, unlikely as it appears, nearly 60 years after independence, is the new battleground of India, a development of the nationalist argument from the independence movement. So India keeps on paying for its poverty and general wretchedness, and its colonial past keeps on paying for its bad history. This new question of history and nationalism is a matter of deep emotion that has to be better understood. It has to be talked about and resolved here in India. It cannot be mediated by academics with an eye on a posting in a university abroad. It might be said that learning is learning, and modern methods of inquiry, as evolved in universities abroad in the last 50 or 60 years, are universal methods, applicable to any situation. But Indian history is still special, with its great vacancies and its glories. Indian history is its culture. To try to sieve it down in the modern way is only to weave a net to catch the wind. And as in the early days of astronomy, the questions raised by modern inquiry in the universities will not always be pertinent. For the academic, as for the poet and the writer, form and content are indivisible. You get what you are looking for. In the mediation of this important and painful Indian heart-searching, certain anachronistic ideas are brought to bear misleadingly on the subject. Far-off ideas such as secularism and antiquated foreign ideas like fascism, which sound modern but explain nothing. I am secular, I'm going for tenure, he is fascist. I am tolerant, I'm getting a green card, he is fascist. I am liberal, he is fascist, he's staying here. It is like the episode in Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver finds himself in the land of giants. Grass grows as high as bamboo. The cat is a monstrous prowling beast with a fearful purr. Soon enough, Gulliver is taken to the palace of the king. The king is at his dining table. He sets Gulliver on the table and asks about the political system of his country. Gulliver, the quaint homunculus, walks up and down among the teacups and spoons. I'm inventing these details. I don't have the book in front of me. And becomes quite heated, Gulliver, as he talks about the rivalries of Whigs and Tories. Whereupon the king takes Gulliver up from the table, sets him on the palm of his hand, and after a hearty fit of laughter, as Swift says, asks Gulliver whether he's a Whig or Tory. I feel like the king of Brobdingnag about much of the talk about liberals and fascists in India today. These words, modern sounding, but in the Indian context antiquated, obscure vision and prevent true inquiry. They're portmanteau words. New countries or new people can reach a stage when they become too educated, too falsely educated for their own good. Bengal was the economic and intellectual leader of India for more than 100 years. Then, as an aspect of being go-ahead and being dazzled by itself, it discovered Marxism. And like poor Russia in 1917, committed suicide. The economic lead of Bengal has vanished, and so has the cultural lead. I said at the beginning that in 1962, newspapers here had little news and many speeches. Today, in a vastly improved time, they overflow with party politics. Politics swamp everything. If you get to know the affiliation of a particular writer, you don't need to read his column. There is no room for ideas outside politics. There is no great philosopher or thinker about social or cultural issues, as there should be in such a great country at such a time of change. But perhaps this is not as worrying as it seems. Perhaps India, in a democratic way, will deal with things as they arise, and deal with them thoroughly. Perhaps the world doesn't need more than one Ruskin or William Morris or Shaw, or more than one Gandhi or Tolstoy. Perhaps these great men dealt for all time with the disturbance of the industrial age. It took Britain 200 years to undo the distress of its industrial revolution, 150 years of humane reformers, and then 50 years of a state socialism, which still continues. It's been a great achievement, but there has been a price. The aristocratic civilization of the 18th century, and then the civilization created by Morris and Shaw and the others, have vanished. What has taken their place in the very shadow of the monuments the tourists come to see is a great modern simplicity, and perhaps in some quarters, modern simpleness, very far from the golden socialist dreams of someone like Morris. It would take another long revolution now to shift this simplicity, so hard come by. And even Morris, in his tapestry factory in Merton in South London, with romantic subjects on every loom, the master straining to get the glittering medieval colors of his fantasy right, even Morris could feel at times that something had escaped him, that though he had given his life and fortune to serving beauty and spreading socialism, his Merton factory, full of busy workers, not overpaid, was not much different from other Victorian factories about him. We must strive to improve things, but we have to learn to live with the idea of imperfection, one kind of imperfection replacing the other. Thank you.